Hello and welcome to an overview of waivers and the alternative care program in Minnesota. Hennepin County's trainings have been converted to YouTube videos, and so when you register, we'll be sending out various topics in a YouTube video format. We hope it's helpful. Waiver background. Minnesota didn't always have the service waivers. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, we relied heavily on institutional placement and regional treatment centers of Faribault and Cambridge and Wilmer and other locations where all the services 24 hours a day were delivered in the same environment. In the 80s and 90s, waivered services began developing, and waivered services waived the rules of living in an institutional setting and promoted community placement in smaller but still large 100-bed facilities in some cases or more in the community. So that process has continued to the point that now we have individualized or my own home options, and person-centered approaches are considered more so. People want to know, what's a waiver? We hear about waivered services a lot. Waivered services are funds that support the services for people with disabilities. We may say they waive the rules of living in nursing homes, hospitals, or intermediate care facilities for people with developmental disabilities. Waivered services are a higher, more comprehensive level of service that follows a person in the community. When an assessment is done for level of care, the assessor is considering various levels of care. An example would be for a person with a developmental disability and related condition. They're looking at intermediate care facility level of care. An intermediate care facility is like a group home. They're required to have a dietitian. They're required to have a nurse. They have prescriptive menus that might have 4 ounces of protein, a half a cup of vegetables, a half a cup of starch. They're required to have a fire drill once a month, etc., and active treatment. And so the person would be at risk of living in a place called an intermediate care facility, or they could live at home with supports. The same goes for other environments like a hospital. With the Community Alternative Care Waiver, the CAC waiver, they're screened at hospital level of care, where they need nursing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and medical supports and services. And so the CAC waiver allows them to live at home with those supports that are quite intense and expensive versus living in a hospital. But even though the supports are expensive, they're still less expensive than living in a hospital. So waivered services have to be cost effective or less expensive than living in these other facilities. Another level of care is nursing home level of care for the CADI waiver. And so considering if the person has medical needs that require nursing home level of care. For the brain injury waiver, there's 2 levels of care: nursing home level of care and neurobehavioral level of care, neurobehavioral hospital level of care. So if a person was in a hospital, consider that the person was able to participate in active treatment, but they maybe had an infection in their brain, and so they needed more intense supports and services. So they went to Bethesda Hospital in St. Paul, which specializes in brain injury. And so that person would qualify for neurobehavioral level of care through a brain injury waiver if that was an option, if they chose that option. Waiver services have a higher level, a higher threshold to be considered. Waivered services are assessed related to the person's level of care, as we talked about: nursing home, hospital, intermediate care facility, neurobehavioral hospital. The assessor also considers if the person has unmet service needs. So an example would be medical assistance funded services aren't meeting the need of the person or their needs are unmet. If the person had services like personal care attendant services, PCA services are relatively common. PCA providers help with bathing, dressing, grooming, and provide direct supports to the person. But maybe the person needed more than that. Maybe they needed some waivered service. Maybe they needed respite, a break for the primary caregiver. Maybe they needed home delivered meals. Maybe they wanted a live-in caregiver. And so you could say that some of their needs were not met, were unmet. So just having PCA wasn't meeting their needs. They needed a higher level of care. Some of these services through medical assistance, as we mentioned, are personal care attendant services, but also a service called Consumer Support Grant, which gives the person a choice to be the employer, to hire and train staff, to use another set of services like horseback riding therapy, art therapy, music therapy, prescribed special diet. Other services like Family Support Grant for children and young adults that provide a monthly grant or an amount of money for them to address the barriers that are existing because of the person's disability, to purchase respite, to purchase staffing, to purchase those services we mentioned, or even some county-funded programs. Hannibal County has a unique program called It's Working, which focuses on working components and helping people to assess their work, to provide training and support so they can find a job or develop a business, and it's county funded. So these are all supports and services that families may want to consider before looking at waivered services because it's a higher threshold. The money that we have to address waiver capacity is set by the state legislature ongoing. Counties manage the limited waiver funds we have within their total aggregate funding, and the goal for them is not to exceed the total. These are the waivered services and the alternative care program in Minnesota. For those folks under age 65, the developmental disabilities waiver is for people with a developmental disability or related condition that fall within the intermediate care facility level of care. The key for the developmental disability waiver is habilitation, to teach, train, mentor, challenge a person to be as independent as possible, to teach a skill. The CADI waiver, Community Access for Disability Inclusions waiver, is nursing home level of care. So their focus is more medically necessary services to help and assist and support them. The CAC waiver, Community Alternative Care, is hospital level of care. So it's a very high level of care with nursing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and other types of therapies and support in the home. Often people on CAC level of care have around a respirator, or they have a feeding tube in addition to the respirator, so they have very complex medical issues. Brain injury waiver has two levels: nursing home level of care or neurobehavioral hospital level of care. A person with a brain injury typically would be diagnosed after age 21. To qualify for the brain injury waiver, it's not supposed to be something that happened developmentally or at a younger age. It's something that occurred at an older age, potentially through an illness or an accident or an incident that happened. All of these waivers are for folks under age 65. It's important for people at age before 65, 64 and a half, to get informed consent so they can understand that they have a choice of continuing on the waiver they have or going to elderly waiver or alternative care program. The elderly waiver is a waiver where people are open to medical assistance, and they have similar supports and services that we're going to talk about. The alternative care program is not a waiver, it's a state-funded program to defer people from needing to go to an expensive nursing home. People often choose to be at home with supports versus going to a nursing home anyway. If they have higher assets that they wouldn't qualify for medical assistance, they might qualify for the alternative care program They look at their income and assets to see if they meet that criteria. So in groups of funding and services, again, the Developmental Disabilities Waiver, here represented as DD, is focused on intermediate care facility level of care and habilitation, teaching, training, mentoring, challenging the person to be as independent as possible. The CAC waiver, CADI waiver, brain injury waiver focus on long-term care, medically necessary kinds of services as well, and focus on hospital level of care, nursing home level of care, and neurobehavioral hospital level of care. The elderly waiver, or EW, and alternative care program focus on nursing home level of care. They're for individuals that are 65 years or older. And within the menu of services of all these waivers, there are home medical assistance funded home care services or personal care attendant services. Personal care attendant services are not waivered services, but they can be provided within the budget of the waiver as a choice or service or support through the waiver budget. Some of these basic home care services are PCA. PCA, personal care attendant services, is delivered in a few different models. PCA choice allows the person to direct their services a little bit more, to train the staff and supervise the staff. Flexible use allows a person to use services more flexibly, to use more hours of service in 1 month and less hours in another month. Straight personal care attendant services requires the supervision of a nurse. In addition to PCA, there's skilled nursing visits that might be available, private duty nursing, and home health aid. These are typically paid through straight medical assistance or managed care programs, and again, they can also be funded under the budget of a waiver, even though they're not waivered services specifically. Medical assistance home care therapies in itself are not waivered services, but they're paid through medical assistance. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech and language pathology, respiratory therapy. But when these services extend beyond what medical assistance provides, so the therapist might say, we've reached a threshold, we've reached a maximum progress level, and so we can't continue this through medical assistance anymore. There are some options to continue it through waivered services and extend it, or call them extended services, extended home care services, for a time limited period of time. So when they're extended, they're waivered services. When they're not extended, they're home care services paid through medical assistance. I'm going to give you a little background. Several years ago, there's been work through a project called Waiver Reimagined. Before we can talk about services that are available today, we need to sidetrack a bit and explain how services will be evolving in the future, starting in about January 2021 and for 2 or 3 years beyond that. The plan for this has been called Waiver Reimagined. So relatively recently, the Department of Human Services sent out a request for public comment regarding amendments that are proposed or changes that are proposed in the brain injury, CAC, CADI, and developmental disabilities waivers. This public comment period is happening right now. It began July 24th, 2020, and it ends August 24th, 2020. So what's happening? We're beginning to implement the goals of Waiver Reimagined, and the goals are to simplify the waivered service menu. In a minute, you'll see that each of the waivers has around 30 different service options. They've thought of everything. And the goal of Waiver Reimagined is to streamline these services and kind of collapse them into larger categories. They're going to introduce a transition period, again, that will begin around January 2021 for at least 2 years and beyond. Upon each person's annual review, they'll be moving from the waiver options that we'll be talking about today into these new categories of service. They're going to introduce a communication plan. The Department of Human Services is introducing a communication plan to share with the general public. As services evolve and change, this will be done through public meetings, through email distribution, and other methods. So everybody's going to get the information and learn about how services might be evolving and changing. Currently, we're in phase 1 of the Waiver Reimagine project. According to the Department of Human Services, the amendments are phase 1 of the Waiver Reimagine project. They changed the current service menu to streamline duplicative services across the current service array. They address the intent of the HCBS setting standards more fully. They also support community inclusion and expand services to create more options for people and more flexibility. This flexibility has been in process for the past several years, and it's evolved into what we're seeing today and what we're going to see in the future. They note that these changes will not result in any decrease in services and supports for people who are currently using waivered services. So the options they have now will continue with more flexibility. New waivered services beginning January 2021. The 5 that are introduced are called Community Residential Services, Individualized Home Supports, Family Residential Services, Integrated Community Supports, and Day Supports and Services. Again, these services are meant to streamline and consolidate many of the waivered services currently offered. I'm not going to go into the description of these 5 services currently because it's a little premature. Today we're going to talk about what we have now to use until that transition period. If you'd like more information, I've attached an email with a request for public input, the information that the Department of Human Services sent to us, so you can feel free to take a look at that and provide input before the deadline if you're interested. This is the contact information for submitting comments. The comments will be accepted by mail and email as well, and there's an address at the bottom for you to take a look at. Now back to what's available today. It was important to give you kind of a glimpse of what's happening in the future, what's happening now, but we're going to talk about what's happening today, what we have available today. If you got a new waiver today, these are the things that we'd be talking to you about and giving you kind of a vision for the future, but talking about what's available today. So how do we start? If we don't have a waiver, how do we start that consideration process? It started with an assessment process. In Henry County, if you don't have a relationship with a case manager right now, you would call the front door at 612-348-4111. The Min Choices assessment is a standardized assessment that most counties in the state of Minnesota have moved to. It is consolidated a lot of different types of assessment into one, so all the services you're looking for will be considered as a part of the Min Choices assessment. It's a person-centered assessment completed by the county nurse or social worker or assessor. The person-centered planning process is used to develop a community support plan which describes the person's needs, goals, and how the needs will be met. A determination is made regarding which program is best. Final authorization is from the Minnesota Department of Human Services. So having a Min Choices assessment doesn't guarantee that you're going to meet the level of care of a waiver, but it's a first step to help assess that need, to determine what needs you have. And once your needs are assessed, the services and supports that are determined are supposed to meet that need through the planning process. Some other considerations at the time of assessment. What services are necessary to ensure the person's health, safety, and welfare? Have the person's desires, needs, and preferences been addressed? What are the barriers that exist because of the person's disability? What are the challenges? What are the unmet needs? Can the services be provided by another funding source? Because the waiver is the final and last funding source, we need to pay attention to other services. So could it be medical assistance? Could it have been consumer support grant? Could it be family support grant? Could it be personal care attendant services? Could it be the county's its working program? What are some other ways the service could be met? And are the services you're considering cost effective? Are they reasonable? Are they customary? Are they cost effective? We're going to talk about each waiver individually, how they're the same and how they're different. One of the most common waivers is the CADI waiver. The next common waiver is the Developmental Disabilities waiver. With the CADI waiver, community access for disability inclusion, people have to be eligible for medical assistance. They have to be certified disabled, and there's two ways that they can be certified disabled. They could be open to Social Security already, or they can participate in an assessment process through the state of Minnesota called SMRT, through the State Medical Review Team. The SMRT process is accessed or started with the county, in this case Henry County, by calling the front door 612-348-4111. For the CADI waiver, the person needs to be under age 65 years old, and they need nursing assessment level of care. They need supports and services over what state MA plan covers, because CADI waiver is the last payer. With each of the waivers, I'm going to provide a list of all the services that are available through the waiver. I'll go through the complete list through the CADI waiver, and then after the other waivers, if there's a duplication, I won't be referencing that. I've highlighted other services that are different in other waivers as well. So you can see there's a lot of waivered options. 24-hour emergency assistance is a plan you develop with the case manager to address issues you might have incidentally. An example might be a parent is coming home from work and every day they're home at 4 o'clock, but you live in the great state of Minnesota and it's winter and a big snowstorm blew in. So you know that your child left school early. You need to call a neighbor. You need to call a friend and have them meet the child at home or have the child dropped off at your house. This is only going to be happening once in a while, but it's an option. And so that might be called 24-hour emergency assistance, where you set up an agreement with that person to do that task to help the kid out once in a while. Adult companion services. These are kind of more informal supports. I know a person that served in the war and he developed a memory issue, and he liked to run, and so he would run for miles, but he would get lost sometimes. So he hired a friend of his that was an athlete that liked to run also, and his friend would help him get back home safely. There's two types of adult day services. There's adult day services to provide meaningful activity, and there's adult day services with a bath to offer an accessible bath option for people that might not have an accessible bathroom at their home. Caregiver living expenses is quite a different option. Caregiver living expenses for an adult living in their own home pays for the rent and food of that live-in caregiver who's more or less their roommate. The live-in caregiver is provides paid staff, paid services for at least 1 hour a day, but they provide non-formal supports or informal supports as a roommate as well. There's links to all these services, and I've provided a link that you can click on these services, and there's a whole page that describes that. But caregiver living expenses is a really great tool to help people be more independent. You know, the person live with them and provide support. All waiver services have a case manager. They might have a case manager aide. The case manager completes the community services and support plan and helps the person to get the services they want and authorizes the services and meets with the person regularly, either by phone or in person, to make sure they're getting what they want. Chore services are heavy-duty cleaning, moving heavy objects, helping a person to move just by helping them pack or organize their possessions, those kinds of things, heavy-duty kinds of things. We're going to save consumer-directed community support until the last part of the presentation. Consumer-directed community support is a very different service where you are the employer. You have a federal and state tax ID number and a workers' compensation number. So we'll save that. Each of the waiver services, each of the waiver programs we talk about today has the service consumer-directed community support, including the elderly waiver and the alternative care program. Crisis respite was added to the CADI waiver relatively recently. Crisis respite is a very expensive service, sometimes more than $800 a day, where the person goes to one of many Metro crisis beds, or they could have augmented staff at their home, or they could have an assessment, an environmental assessment, or a behavioral assessment, as well for a time-limited period of time. And then regular respite is just a break for the care provider. It could be the person goes out to a home or with a person for several hours or a day, or the person comes into the house and the caregiver goes out for several hours or a day. Customized living and Customized Living Plus, which is 24-hour care, is a program that provides an apartment and meals and often medical supports like nursing and help with medication administration and other kinds of things that they can request. The services employment exploration, employment development, and employment support were added relatively recently. These are individualized or individual programs. Exploration is helping a person to determine what kind of work they would like to do. Development is a person that will help them find the job, and support is staffing support on the job. Environmental accessibility adaptation. So if you're a person living in your house and you have a wheelchair, you need a ramp to your house. You might need to modify the bathroom to increase, take the tub out and put in a walk-in shower. You might need an accessible van. So you pay for the basic van, and the waiver would maybe raise the roof or lower the floor and put a ramp in the van and modify the van so you can use that. We can spend up to $40,000 in addition to the CADI budget for modifications. With consumer-directed community support, it's a little different. The first $5,000 of your major modification must come from your budget, but in other cases, it's outside of your budget. Extended home care and extended PCA. So if the person was hospitalized, they come home, they need additional care and supports and assistance, we can, and their assessed PCA hours were 5 hours, maybe they need 3 hours more and they have money within their budget. So we can say that we're going to extend a PCA or use extended PCA for 3 hours more. Then they have 8 hours per day. The extended services, the 3 hours, are waivered services and must be delivered by a waiver provider. And generally they're time limited. They're not forever. They're until the person gets better or recovers or improves. Family training and counseling is an option for person-centered planning, for self-advocacy training, for a number of ways to support and train the person with a disability and the family. Foster care for adults and children. CADI waiver actually pays for foster care. So it's something to consider if you're looking for the support of a person to provide meals during the day and a safe place to live. Home delivered meals are optioned through the CADI waiver. 1 meal a day up to 7 days a week through a vendor that's certified to be a home delivered meal provider. Homemaking services. Homemaking services are cleaning services, light duty cleaning, cooking, grocery shopping, those kinds of things. In-home family support is a relatively new service added to the CADI waiver. It's licensed hourly or daily services in the family's home that will teach the person skills, that will help them to learn more independent living skills during the daytime. ILS training, individualized living skills training. Again, teaching skills. Night supervision. Sometimes people have trouble sleeping at night and they get up and they're disoriented or they need help and supervision at night. And so night supervision can be an option. Personal support, care and support at home and in the community. Maybe taking somebody to a baseball game, making sure that they get there safely and get back home safely. Personal support is a service that doesn't require additional training. It's more care and support in the community. It's just providing that supervision and support and help. Positive support services or positive behavioral support services can be options to entice people to move in a certain positive direction by providing them incentives, by pairing it with a behavior program, and those kinds of things. Pre-vocational services, allowing the person to experience work, to learn about being on time, to learn about pacing themselves, to learn about what work is all about. And remote support. So there's devices that if we need help, we can press the device and we can call somebody and we could contact a care support provider, we could contact emergency assistance, whatever we needed. Specialist services. That service has been expanded recently to include the ability for us to use a specialist to implement a person-centered plan. If you had a person-centered plan, sometimes the plan kind of just stays stagnant. People might not look at it and implement it, or sometimes we don't have the staff supports to implement the plan itself, but a specialist could implement the plan, help people get involved in the community, look at those goals and objectives that were established and try and make those connections. A specialist can also be used for other things like behavioral supports or other specialties because of their education, their experience, their training that they can provide help with. Transitional services. There's so much to talk about with transitional services, but this is an overview. Imagine I lived in a nursing home, and to live in a nursing home, I had to spend down most of my money and most of my savings to get onto medical assistance. And I've been there for a year, and all of a sudden I got better and improved. I wanted to move back home, but I've spent all my money. So what do? How am I going to pay for the deposit? How am I going to pay for basic furniture? How am I going to pay for the moving expenses? So transitional services allow a certain pot of money to pay for these certain things, to pay for moving expenses, application fees, certain amounts of furniture that's maybe adaptive or modified. It even includes the option for my own home. So if I'm moving from my own home to another location, I could use that for helping me relocate, in addition to chore services to help me to pack the things up that I need. Transportation is listed. Most of the services include transportation as a part of the rate, but transportation can be per trip or per mile and could be added to make sure that people are getting what they needed regarding. So again, that's a lot of information all at once. That's a complete description of these services. The information I'm going to send you has a link that you can click on each service and have at least a page description of the service and get more detail. For the services coming up, the waivered services coming up, I'm just going to describe the waiver itself, and then if there's a new service, I'll mention that, but I'm not going to go through the whole list again. Brain injury waiver, or BI waiver. People like the CADI waiver are eligible for medical assistance. They're certified disabled by being open to Social Security already or applying, or going through the state medical review team to be certified disabled with a letter. That letter isn't good forever. It's good for several years, and eventually you'll have to be recertified again. They have to be under age 65. They have to be diagnosed as having an acquired brain injury. So that means that it's not present from birth. If it's present from birth, that's more or less a developmental disability. They're looking at something that happened later in life. They have to be able to participate in rehabilitation. So they can't be in a situation where they cannot participate. They have to be able to participate in help and support and assistance. They need nursing facility or neurobehavioral level of care. They need the supports and services only available through the brain injury waiver through cognitive behavioral, because of their cognitive behavioral impairment. So the brain injury waiver, again, is a last payer. We have to look at other funding to ensure that the things they're looking for can't be paid through personal care attendant, consumer support grant, family support grant, its working program, and other services. With a brain injury waiver, there are a couple services that haven't been listed before that are in the menu for brain injury. ILS Therapies, Independent Living Skills Therapy. And so learning skills over again. I knew how to do this before, but I have a brain injury. Now I need to learn how to do it again. And a structured day program to provide meaningful activity during the day so that maybe my natural supports and my care supports can go to work during the day, and then I have a place that I can spend during the day until they come home at night. The developmental disabilities waiver, again, is one of the most common waivers that we have with the most number of people enrolled, in addition to the CADI waiver. It is, as we discussed, the intermediate care level of care. We need the services and supports over what medical assistance state plan covers, because the DD waiver is the last payer. A person has to be diagnosed as a person with a developmental disability or related condition. They require a daily intervention or a 24-hour plan of care. So it doesn't mean they have to have people with them 24 hours a day, but there has to be a plan of care for how they're going to get their needs met. And they've made an informed choice of having waivered services versus intermediate care facility level of care services. Waivered services through the DD waiver are habilitative. We don't talk about that a lot. We don't hear the word habilitative. We know what rehabilitative is. If I had an injury and I injured my rotator cuff, I have surgery, I come back and I go to physical therapy and I rehabilitate my arm so I can reach above my head to put glasses that covered. People with disabilities, people with developmental disabilities might not have learned a skill ever. And so they need to learn the skill from scratch. An example, tying the shoe. If I was walking around a lake and I had a staff with me and my shoe was untied, and if I had personal care attendant services, which is not habilitative, the staff would say, Jerry, sit down. I don't want you to fall. Let me tie your shoe. If I have the DD waiver and the staff's with me and my shoe's untied, they might say, Jerry, sit down. I don't want you to fall. Let's practice tying your shoe. Remember, at home, We tied your shoe, we did this loop with the other loop, and you pull them together. Let's try that right now. I'm learning the skill to tie my shoe, or I'm learning the skill to make a salad, or I'm learning the skill to ride the bus. There's certain services that are, by definition, habilitative that we'll talk about in the next slide, that must be in the plan. So there's a few services here that aren't listed in the other waivers. Assistive technology that will help me access my environment. Day training and habilitation. Day training and habilitation was a very significant service historically. People were home and they all went to a day training and habilitation center. There weren't a lot of choices. But now, since the introduction of employment exploration, development, and support, there's a lot more options for people. Day training and habilitation does not focus on vocational supports anymore. Their role has changed and modified to provide meaningful activity, and instead, employment exploration, development, and support focuses on the employment aspects. Residential habilitation or supported living services. So daily or hourly supports in the person's home that are habilitated to teach, train, mentor, challenge the person to be more independent as possible. In order to have a habilitative service, respite or homemaker, or a habilitative service like in-home family support or supported living services must be used monthly and ongoing in a reasonable plan. The state doesn't describe exactly what amounts, it just has to be monthly, ongoing, in a reasonable plan. It doesn't have to be all the services, it has to be at least one. Respite, homemaker, habilitation, which could be in-home family support or supported living services, one of those. Respite and homemaker provide a break to the primary caregiver. So if you're using respite or homemaker, the understanding is the primary caregiver is teaching, training, mentoring, challenging the person to be as independent as possible during their non-paid time. So the state sees this as habilitative because they're giving the primary caregiver a break through respite or homemaker services. Community alternative care waiver, hospital level of care. Again, they have to be eligible for medical assistance, certified disabled, under age 65. They need hospital level of care. The primary doctor certifies that level of care. So we have a higher level of determination. Needing the supports and services over what medical assistance can provide. So some people can qualify for 24 hours of nursing through PCA services. It's not very common, but it can happen. So they make an informed choice of having the CAC waiver, which could allow respite, homemaker, these other services. If those choices are more in line with the supports needs for the person, they might choose waived services over state home care services. But the needs and the supports of the services, again, must be over and above what the state MA plan covers. Under the CAC service menu, family adult daycare services are listed. And so all the other services are the same as many of the other waivers. You'll see some of the services might fall off of the list. So I'm just highlighting the ones that are new and different. Elderly waiver and alternative care program. Again, it's important that people get informed choice before they turn age 65. At age 65, it's too late for them to access the DD waiver, the CADI waiver, the CAC waiver, the brain injury waiver, and so they need that informed consent. The menus listed is a little less comprehensive, then the menus that we've seen, you'd see that there's less services available. The budget is set by the home care rating, so the budget is determined by a chart. If you look up your home care rating, you can actually determine your budget, and the budgets for the other waivers are determined through a rates management process, except for consumer direct support, which is determined based on a formula and the assessment. Elderly waiver is a program for people open to medical assistance, and the alternative care program is a service of the state of Minnesota that's not a waiver for people that don't qualify for medical assistance because their income is low, but it's still higher than the threshold for medical assistance. So there is an assessment done to look at a person's income to see what level they would meet if they would qualify for elderly waiver or alternative care. And most people on elderly waiver are on a managed care program or a prepaid medical assistance plan. So then we finally get to consumer-directed community support. Consumer-directed community support started in Minnesota in the late 90s, early 2000. It's a flexible service across all waivers in Minnesota and the alternative care program. It's very flexible, very different. The person has control of the use of funds in a reasonable way. They have responsibility to use the funds to meet the person's assessed needs, but they also have control to determine how they're going to use the funds within their budget. The budgets are individually tailored within a state-set budget, and the state uses a formula to determine the actual amount of money that's available. People on consumer-directed community support can use consumer-directed programs that they create, or they can also use the traditional services that we've been mentioning so far. The person or the managing party, person with a disability, is the employer. They are the employer. They have a federal and state tax ID number and a workers' compensation number. They set the rate within guidelines, and currently they are about $13.25 is the minimum amount that we can set because the union has determined that is the lowest rate we can pay. If you live in the city of Minneapolis, there's going to be a higher rate because the city of Minneapolis has negotiated a higher rate for businesses to pay their employees. And the highest rate is whatever the PCA rate maximum is. And so it's less than $18 an hour. The person with the disability or the employer also determines a work schedule. They write the plan. They hire the staff, train the staff, supervise the staff, and set the rate of pay within that range. So an example of what people on consumer-directed community support services do and traditional services. Sometimes I compare traditional license services that we've been talking about to a restaurant, where you go to the restaurant, the provider has a menu. If you imagine like your favorite restaurant, they have a menu. If there's more than one restaurant like that, they probably have the same menu or similar items. Traditional license services under the CADI waiver or the DD waiver have that menu of services they can offer. And so they set the rate of reimbursement. They write the plan or help you write the plan. They train the staff. They hire the staff. They help develop the health and safety plan. And the county approves a plan. And so if you went to a restaurant, it would not be okay to go in the kitchen and start cooking, because the expectation is the restaurant is providing you the service. They're hiring the staff and training the staff. Consumer-directed community support is different. Theoretically, consumer-directed community support, it would be okay to go in the kitchen and start cooking. Under consumer-directed community supports, it is consumer-directed, and so you set the rate of pay within a range, you write the plan, you train the staff, you hire the staff, you develop the health and safety plan. You can select services and supports in the general public in the community that meet the person's assessed needs, or you can use traditional license services as well, and the county approves the plan. So more or less, it might be like going to a grocery store where you pick things off the shelf that might meet the needs of the person, that are cost effective, that you want to put in your plan. These services listed are only available through consumer-directed community support. An idea that you can pay parents of minor children to provide care for their child, or husbands to provide care for their wife, or wives to provide care for their husbands if they have a disability and are open to a waiver. Special prescribed diet, gluten-free diet, casein-free diet, ketogenic diet, hypoglycemic diet, controlled protein diet, low cholesterol diet. These are all diets that we can implement. We offer a percentage reimbursement. A common percent might be 25% of the USDA's Department of Agriculture's liberal food plan for a person age 1 to 21, 50, 90, etc. Each year we go through and we look at what the USDA has averaged for people birth to death, and we assign a percentage, a common percentage. Each of the diets might have a little different percentage, so it's meant that we pay for the difference between a $7 loaf of gluten-free bread and a $3 loaf of bread in the grocery store. Behavioral supports or behavioral incentives for the person with a disability to help them to move in a certain positive direction, to provide an incentive, paired with a behavior program and oftentimes a behavioralist. Augmentative therapies, or therapies that are more direct. Music therapy, horseback riding therapy, art therapy, other non-experimental therapies. And these are direct therapies. The music therapist comes to your house with a keyboard, with a drum set, or the hippotherapy, you go to the ranch, you go to the western suburbs or the southern suburbs or western Wisconsin to these programs. And the therapist is trained and the horse is oriented and you learn how to balance yourself. Art therapy, calming therapy, etc. Each of these therapies has an asterisk at the end requires a prescription from a doctor or completion of a form called the alternative treatment form. Prescribed special diet, behavioral supports, augmentative therapies all require a prescription from a doctor or an alternative treatment form, which indicates that the therapy or the service is not experimental. That was a lot of information. I appreciate the time that I was able to spend with you. I've left my contact information here for you. Feel free to email me. The best way to reach me is email. I've listed my phone number as well. For ongoing training information, the website with our booklet on is hennepin.us/CMTYSUPPORT. And I'll look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.